On behalf of Rick Steckety and me, Shyla Pantlin, co-directors of the Osher Lifelong Institute here at Aquinas, welcome to this beautiful Aquinas College campus. This evening will be the third presentation of 6 special events we have planned to help celebrate this, our 35th year anniversary of the Emeritus College program. A special welcome to Sister Aquinas Weber, who's here in the front with a red jacket, who was one of the she was one of the founders of Emeritus, and also to the other trustees that are here in the audience tonight. Welcome to all of you. It was January 16th, 1991, when we were all glued to our televisions observing the beginning of our involvement in the first Gulf War. This first operation, Desert Shield, played out before us, as you will remember, in amazing efficiency. The planes and the rockets and the bright lights were there for all of America and for the world to see, and it was live. I remember crying, not because it was frightening, it was that, but because I was so incredibly proud of the bright minds and brave hearts of those who were there risking their lives for all of us back home. Well, tonight, we are fortunate to have with us one of the brightest and the best from that triumphant military operation. And it is a great honor for me to introduce to you successful businessman, community leader, Aquinas College Board trustee, loving father and husband, and one of America's finest, Lieutenant General John Nowak.
Thanks, Shyla. I guess I'm hot. Everybody can hear it. I want to thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure for me to have an opportunity to do this. Normally, I get to do it holding a glass of scotch in the Officers Club bar. So I will clean up some of the stories and hopefully give you some sense of what went on behind Desert Shield, in particular the first half of the Desert Shield, Desert Storm operations. I want to make sure I get a chance to let you know, to make sure that I keep this honest and on track. My wife is here with me, Maureen, right over here. We're actually here celebrating 15 happy years of marriage. 15 happy years out of 48 ain't that bad, right? Now, Shyla, I'm delighted you kept that introduction short. I always worry about long introductions. People start giving you credit for things you really didn't do, and then you have to deny them. And it always reminds me of when I was a young colonel, I was in charge of a thing called the Combined Federal Campaign, which was very much like the United Way funds that you have in the civilian community. And we did very well. We raised a lot of money and contributed it into the the United Fund coffers. And so, it was sort of a gratitude thing. They said, how about if, you, Colonel Nowak, come tour some of the places that benefited from the money you guys raised, and, they get a sense of what the military contribution is. I said, sure, I'd be glad to do that. So we went to several places. The one that stands out most in my mind, though, was one that I guess today we would call them a birthing house, places where ladies who go to have babies, particularly if they're having some difficulty in their terminal state of pregnancy. But the reason this one stood out in my mind, though, is when we went there, we walked in and the nurse who ran that operation asked all the ladies if they'd gather around and give a big round of applause to Colonel Nowak, because if it weren't for his energetic efforts, none of the ladies would be there today. That was not true. That was not true. So I'm always sensitive to truth. One of the truths I'm really sensitive to, when we first sent out some of the the initial notifications about this thing occurring, one of the things they talked about was General Nowak a top aide to General Schwarzkopf. That was not true. Almost, but not true. My boss would be very upset with me if I didn't tell you the truth of how this thing works. And so what I want to do is tell you a little bit about where I really fit in and where we did. We start here with the Commander-in-Chief, which is actually the President of the United States, but this, of course, is his important role. From him comes down, and you have the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the JCS, and then down here, you have this line where it goes to CENTCOM, General Schwarzkopf. Another one over here called TRANSCOM, my boss. And over here would be, in this case, it was EUCOM, because we were operating through the European theater. There's Atlantic Command over here who gathers the forces in the United States to send them over to CENTCOM. Under CENTCOM are the forces, actually. And under TRANSCOM are three entities. This one, which is Military Airlift Command. This one, which is Army Materiel Command. And this one, which is the Navy Sealift Command. This guy is in charge of all transportation of all forces and materials into a theater of operation, no matter where it is in the world. What they call this setup is the supported sink, the guy who has to fight the war, that was General Schwarzkopf, and the supporting commanders-in-chief for sinks, guys like the European Command who gave them places to stage through, and of course TRANSCOM, who has to get everything there to him. I was right, this guy, TRANSCOM, and this guy, Military Airlift Command, are really the same guy. He holds two hats. And I worked directly for him as his deputy commander for all logistics operations. So it's the only time in my life I only had one guy between me and the President of the United States. So it was an interesting time, to say the least. And so that'll give you some sense of where I really did fit, and why I say the focus of my talk tonight is really going to be on Desert Shield, the first half of that, and we'll talk a little bit about the storm afterwards. But I think what's important to know is, why was Airlift such a big deal? Well, the simple fact is, when this whole thing kicked off, we had absolutely no forces in the Middle Eastern theater. Saudi Arabians had no interest in having U.S. forces at any time. It was a very sensitive issue. Most of the Gulf countries around them were equally reluctant for lots of reasons, some political, some religious, but generally worried about maintaining their independence and worried, quite frankly, about our relationship with Israel. So it really was a matter of, we were starting with ground zero and having to move all those things in there quickly. Well, there was only one way we could do it, and do it in any amount of time, and that was the use of airlift. And so that's kind of where I'm going to focus and try to give you some sense of what went on and why. Probably the place to start is to review, so that we have fresh in our mind what in the world was going on at that time, back in mid-1990. As you recall, during the 1980s, Iraq was probably not on our enemies list. In fact, the U.S. government was sort of nurturing a relationship with Iraq. President Bush later said that, they were important to us. They were the buffer country, if you would, between Iran, which was pretty radical at the time under the Ayatollah Khomeini, and those huge oil reserves and all the countries that were closer allies of our country, you know, as it fit geographically at that point. I think the key point in there is, though, recognizing the importance of Iraq at that point as a buffer to Iran. Now, really our relations with them were relatively good at that time. In fact, in the spring of 1990, a group of U.S. senators, a group of 7 led by John Kerry, were over there visiting with Saddam, trying to open some sort of further discussion. We were working on a large agricultural loan at that time to Iraq, and the Department of Commerce was actually looking at lifting export controls that had been in there for some time, probably largely in retaliation to the war between Iran and Iraq, which had occurred about 1.5 years to 2 years earlier. Let's see here. Everybody probably remembers this guy. As for him, you know, he was beginning to feel a little bit of pressure. He needed cash. They had the war between Iran and Iraq. He was a little upset, particularly at Kuwait. He accused them constantly of flooding the world with cheap oil, and had begun to put pressure on Kuwait that they owed him $10 billion for the revenues that he felt he lost because they refused to raise their prices. He was kind of equally upset with OPEC at that time. He was trying to get them to come up with more substantial controls on the amount of oil to be produced, and force Kuwait and other participants in OPEC to come up with a higher price. On 19 July of 1990, amidst no particular, I don't recall, increase in pressure or level of dialogue, the Iraqis began to move their army forces that were always referred to as the elite Republican Guard, along with their armored forces from the middle of the country, where they normally did their training, to the eastern border, which of course was right on the border of Kuwait. At that time, the JCS chairman, General Colin Powell, said the intelligence people had come and you know, briefed them that that was going on, but they didn't really view it with alarm at that time, because all those movements were clearly within the borders of Iraq, and it didn't appear that you know, at the time, that it was anything more than just repositioning and posturing. However, as a precaution at least, they deployed 2 KC-135 air refueling airplanes to the United Arab Emirates. So when I say there were no forces in the Gulf zone or Gulf region, I guess there were 2 American refueling tankers. And other than that, I think the Navy arrayed some ships in a picket line for air defense out in the Persian Gulf. Beyond that, nothing really happened at that time. The U.S. Commander of Air Forces under General Schwarzkopf at that time was a Lieutenant General Chuck Horner. And he was also, in his stateside capacity, the commander of the 9th Air Force out at Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina. He's kind of an independent thinker, and as he watched what was going on, he decided that the Air Force better be ready, so he put 2 wings, F-15 wing at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia and an F-16 wing at Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina on alert, so that there would be somebody, at least in the process of getting ready, to deploy, and thinking about, you know, what they might have to do in the theater of operation once they got over there. On July 24th, I think there was enough additional alarm after a week of border posturing that President Hosni Mubarak of Egypt made a trip to Iraq and had a meeting with Saddam, at which he was assured by Saddam that he had no intention of invading Kuwait. So at least satisfied, if not appeased, President Mubarak went back to to Egypt. The next day, July 25th, Ambassador April Glaspie, who was a career Foreign Service officer, scheduled a meeting with Saddam Hussein, wanting to make sure she at least had an opportunity to talk to him, I think, and get some feel for what he was thinking with the posturing. But in the course of discussions with him, basically she said that the United States really had no interest in Arab-to-Arab conflicts, such as his current disagreement with Kuwait. General Schwarzkopf, commander of Central Command, was called to Washington on the 1st of August, and the purpose of that was for him to give Secretary Cheney and Chairman Powell an update on just what was the intelligence estimate of what was going on the border. He went in there, and I think essentially what he briefed the Secretary and the Chairman was that the Iraqis certainly had the capability to cross the border if they chose to. I don't think there was any certainty yet about what it was he really was going to do, but they felt that if he did cross the border, in view of the nature of the conflict over oil, what he would probably do would be to seize the Rumaili oil fields, which would have been in the western side of Kuwait, and go no further. And he didn't really think that he had any interest in trying to seize the entire country. I don't know if you can see that clearly, but that's a line of Iraqi tanks in downtown Kuwait City. So I think the bottom line was the intelligence estimate was wrong. I think later on, and it was several years later, April Glaspie, who was, of course, the U.S. ambassador then, made the observation that Saddam was, in her view, a megalomaniac. He believed the U.S. government had no guts, and that we would avoid a fight, and that certainly we would not fight over a little piece of desert called Kuwait. Richard Haas, who was on the National Security Council at that time, observed a little bit later that looking back, based on the signals that had been sent, Saddam probably made a reasonable decision in terms of reasonable guessing what our action might be, and that he could probably get away with it. Well, the reality is none of that was to turn out to be true. On August 2nd, though, they did invade Kuwait, and of course they went right to Kuwait City. They actually bypassed the Rumaili oil fields originally. What was interesting is after they seized control, Saddam immediately declared that there was no Kuwait. They were going to be the 19th province of Iraq, and that this was a permanent arrangement and relationship. One of the interesting things that occurred after that is the Iraqis began to issue Iraqi license plates to all cars in Kuwait City, as if that was going to legitimize the new relationship. Everybody always wondered why in the world would issue a new license plate somehow become such an important point. That of course occurred on the 2nd of August. Also on the 2nd of August, the U.S. condemned that invasion, but really didn't say much more than that. It was several days later, on the 5th of August, after he met with Prime Minister Thatcher of Britain out in Colorado, that President Bush issued the famous announcement that this aggression in Kuwait would not stand. I don't think anybody really knew what Saddam intended to do next at that point. But the reality was he had a major force in Kuwait along the Saudi border. The Saudi area immediately to the south is probably the richest oil field in the world. And so the fear was that as he consolidated his forces and his new possessions, he would get ready to come south. So at that point, priority one was, how do we stabilize and defend Saudi Arabia? On the 6th of August, Secretary Cheney and General Schwarzkopf and General Horner, the air commander, all went to Saudi Arabia to meet with King Fahd. As I said, there had been very little interest in having any U.S. forces in Saudi in the previous time. But at this time, I think the king saw a new light and quickly agreed that he would host U.S. forces in Saudi Arabia. Schwarzkopf and Cheney both turned around and went back to the U.S. and left General Horner, whose picture you see here, in Saudi Arabia. So at that point, we did have U.S. forces of 2 people, General Schwarzkopf and his executive officer, who were now in the theater. Basically, and I have to tell you, Chuck Horner here is one of my dearest friends from the Air Force. He was a commander of a fighter wing that I was the head of logistics, the deputy commander for logistics in, under his command. And in talking to him about this later on, it was interesting. He said that, you know, when you're a force of 2, you spend a lot of time worrying about what are we going to do if they come across the border, because he really had no forces to speak of at all. But as soon as Secretary Cheney and the chairman got back to the U.S., they immediately, on behalf of the government, devised and initiated what became known as Project Desert Shield. And basically what Desert Shield did was recognize that the only viable way we had to get over there was airlift, to get there fast and to be able to do anything at all to provide some line of defense. And so we kicked that exercise off immediately. I think that kind of gets you up to speed on what was happening in 1990, right up until the time this thing got started. And so now what I'd like to do is begin to take a look at, well, what actually happened in all this. Remember what I said, they met with King Fahd on the 6th of August. The first C-141 aircraft, like the one you see pictured up on the top, landed on the 8th of August. Now, kings don't get up early. They're sort of like my wife. And so that meeting with King Fahd was later in the afternoon, so really hardly more than 24 hours later, the first airlift airplane that brought aircraft maintenance people and critical supplies in support of the F-15s that had been put on alert a week or so earlier, landed at Dhahran Air Base in Saudi Arabia. The reality is Airlift always has to get there first. When those fighter airplanes land on the ground, there has to be somebody there to receive them, somebody there to refuel them, get them turned and ready to go. When those airplanes deploy, they are typically fully armed, so once they land, refuel and turn around, they're really ready to go to combat. So basically, in less than 2 days, we had the first two fighter wings, the F-15 wing and the F-16 wing, there in place, and we began to build from there. It was really an overwhelming requirement relative to the amount of forces that we needed to move in August to build up enough of a force in place that we could first deter an attack, then begin to think about some sort of a rollback, and finally an offensive capability. After that first airplane landed, within less than a day and a half, we began to flow airplanes as fast as we could move them through there. You have to remember, the distance is over 7,000 miles. So we typically flew from the continental United States, made